Hello techies, I'm Divya here. On behalf of CyberBrainer, don't you think the world of tech is evolving faster than ever? Now is the perfect time to dive in and build the skills that will take you places. With CyberBrainer, we are putting you in the driver's seat of your own future. We at CyberBrainer don't just teach your interest. We believe that knowledge is power, but it's applied knowledge that truly sets you apart. Whether you're diving into data science, mastering artificial intelligence, or exploring the world of cybersecurity, our courses are designed to give you the skills that matter. So let's jump into the session and make the future yours today. Thank you.
The tasks and the process for creating a matrix report is exactly similar to how we created our advanced reports. My task is create a custom report. We would select the report type as matrix. Give a name to our report. And we are calling it PMG2. And I'm calling worker count. By company, just a standard and advanced report. Any of the data sources can be used. There are just a few data sources which are specific for some report categories. Talk about that, but in terms of a matrix report and advanced report, we can use any of the data sources indexed as AS. The standard data sources or focus data sources or filter data sources, the ones we looked at yesterday. Today, look at this data source, workers for HCM reporting. This is an advanced data source, an indexed data source available on the worker business object. Many times, even when you're dealing with an indexed data source, you may want to uncheck this box. On the initial screen, we had that checkbox optimized for performance. And we discussed if we have that checkbox enabled. Then system only allows us to search for an indexed data source. And in this case, I have selected an indexed data source for my report. Even in that case, there may be cases when we would want to uncheck this box. What happens when this box is checked? When this box is checked, we can only select indexed fields. Even when we are building a report with an indexed data source, we can still access non-indexed fields. All these fields are indexed. And I know that because they are colored this yellow or orange. If we uncheck this box, even though the data source itself is indexed, we would still be able to reference non-indexed fields. Why would you want to do that? Because many a time certain fields are only non-indexed. If you see, now I can access both indexed as non-indexed fields. And while we develop this record report, I'm sure come across some fields, especially with respect to filters, wherein those fields are not available, those fields are not indexed and have to uncheck that box. For now, that is not required, and see when that situation arises, I'll leave this as checked. In addition to this, many indexed data sources come with inbuilt filters. This is similar to inbuilt prompts we saw yesterday. For example, with workers by organization, that data source comes with that inbuilt prompts. This data source again. Comes with inbuilt filter, and there are many filters available I can run this report for. all active workers, which is the one which is defaulted. But then I could select a filter for all terminated workers, all workers and on and forth. While this data source itself is a filter within this, we can then add sub-filters. This data source gives you that flexibility, and this data source was very recent, not very recently. This is one of the latest data sources that have been added by Workday to the worker business object. Are there any questions? Why wouldn't you just choose all terminated workers as your original data source? We can. Are you talking in terms of the data source or in terms of filter? I'm just in terms of filter. Why would you not choose it just as your original data source? If you are building a report wherein you need terminated workers, only terminated workers, then you can use it. You can choose any one of these. It all depends on your requirement. Workday defaults this filter, but let's say I want all workers, both active workers as terminated workers, then I'll choose this one. And this gives me both active as terminated workers. This filter acts that data source all active and terminated workers. I guess, why wouldn't you just, what's the point of the filter? Why wouldn't you just choose it as your original data source instead of choosing a different data source and then going and filtering it? Got two reasons. First is, even if I, for example, I select all active and terminated workers instead of this, because that is a standard data source, the performance would be worse when compared to this. Oh, that makes sense. The reason you would choose an index data source is because it gives you that better performance. That's the whole reason. But that makes sense. This may not be significant for, let's say, a smaller client. If you're, let's say, dealing with a client which has some 5,000 employees, even in that case, always build your report with performance in mind. But when I was working for example, Walmart, and in phase 1, when we went live, they had, I think, 800,000 workers. And subsequently, after 3 phases, their entire global population was on Workday. And with that kind of population on Workday, you want your reports to work good. Because else, when you add these reports to dashboard, especially it is challenging on dashboards. Because dashboards have a timeout limit. When you add a report to a dashboard, and if the report doesn't load within 30 seconds, the report will time out. Especially when you're dealing with reports which have to be available on dashboards as a worklet, a standard data source really doesn't work. It's very challenging. Got it? Thank you. I'll take all active workers because that's what I need for what we are doing now. Now, if you see, most of the tabs are similar to what we solve with an advanced reporter and they perform same function. They have the same capabilities. Look at these tabs in a bit more detail. In which ways? There's a difference, or these two tabs are new when we check with advanced reports. Let's first explore the first tab, matrix. Now look at this tab again. The layout looks completely different. We have something called a row grouping, and then I scroll down. I have something called a column grouping. And then there's a section called summarize. My requirement is to get a count of employees across each of my companies. I don't need the details of those employees. Else, I would have created an advanced report. I simply need count of employees across my companies. In that case, I want to get data or get the worker count based on the company they belong to. I want to group data based on company. The grouping parameter I'll select is company. This could be anything. Maybe I want to group my employees based on their cost center. Or this could be any other requirement. For now, I've selected company. The sort rows, it says sort in a descending order based on the total number of employees in that group in a particular company. This is all I'm going to do now. Let's click on and run this report. These are default prompts which are coming from the data source. My row grouping was company. On each of these rows, system shows me a company within the tenant. And then on the right hand side, it gives me a count against that company. There are 2 6 to 7 workers whose company is blank. Now we want to confirm, or I want to confirm what this count represents. Let's click on one of those. Smaller numbers, when I click on it, it opens this pop-up and it shows me that 42 is the count of employees, and we can quickly verify this. 42 in RA. XYZ Motors Inc. Let's quickly check where this employee belongs to if I see Adam Gray. Job, where can I check the organizations an employee is associated with? I believe you would have covered this in your week 1 training. You can go to this report, which shows all organizations that a given worker is a member of. You can see this person is a member of this company, which is RXYZ Motors. All I had to do was define a grouping, and in the row grouping, I specified company, and that's why each of these companies are represented on a row and against that company, I get a count. Now, how does Workday know that we want to count workers and how? Did Workday count these workers? If I open the report once again and the last section of the report when I showed it to you earlier, there was this section called row grouping, which we defined, and then when we scroll down, we had this section called column grouping. We didn't use it. And then there's this define the fields to summarize and the summarization type. The default summarization type is count. Whenever you're building a matrix report, there should be at least one summarization parameter. The default summarization parameter is count. Now the question is, how does this report automatically count workers? We didn't specify anything here. This summarization type, it simply counts the number of instances that your data source returns. Because this data source returns one row for each worker, each active worker based on information or filter, the count simply counts the instances that are returned by the data source. If I build this a matrix report on, let's say, position business object, count will simply count the instances of the position. That's all it does. It simply counts the instances that are returned by that data source. And then, based on the grouping parameters we have defined, those are grouped accordingly. We have some 2,000 odd employees who do not have any company assignment. And they are sorted in descending order That was the default sort order we had selected. Row total descending, and then, when we scroll to the bottom, it shows me 252 rows, which is 250 companies plus this row called others, and then there's this row at the top, which is blank. If we look at the report, the default for maximum number of rows to be displayed was 250. That's why it shows me 250 rows for companies. And then everything else goes into this other. Had I, for example, selected 200 here, then it would have shown me 200 rows and everything would have been clubbed into others. Let's edit further. I don't need these many companies because it makes analyzing the report difficult. What I'll do is I'll quickly add a filter on the report and select some 4 or 5 companies. Just an advanced report, we can add a filter, and I will. Company. Fantastic. Let's take Switzerland. Denmark, Norway. Take some companies which have a bigger population user. And we have UK and Canada, and this should be enough. Let's quickly run it one more time. All now I'm getting data for those 6 companies that I selected. It gives me this total count if I want. Let's edit our report here. If we don't want that total, we can say high total, row. And if you don't do that, this total row wouldn't be displayed. We have defined row grouping. We can also define column grouping. Let's go ahead and do that. In column, let's say I want to group workers based on their gender. I'm saying gender. Now, if you see my overall numbers, do not change. GMSSA has 344, which is the overall count. The total is still the same, 473. But now this count is further grouped based on the column grouping. GMSS Switzerland has 4 employees. 2 of them do not have any gender. One is male, one is female, or they have not disclosed entered any gender information. I'm still getting the same data or same numbers. But based on the groupings that I have defined, Workday automatically shows this information in those buckets. I can click on any numbers anywhere, and it would show me the population that forms that number. These are those 14 females in GMS India, males in GMS Canada. Once again, I can add a filter to basically remove certain genders. We don't want any employees without any gender assignment, which is basically blank. I can go back and work with my filters. Have you noticed any difference between a matrix report and the advanced report that we discussed yesterday? Whatever we have covered till now, do you see any difference? Not in terms of layout or whatever. Any basic difference that you observe? In terms of capabilities. One difference is, if you have not observed, it doesn't give us the option to select business objects. In an advanced report, the first column was the business object, and it would be defaulted to the primary business object. But then we always had the option to select one of the related business objects and then pull data. In a matrix report, we don't have that option. We cannot pull data from or directly use fields from a related business object. Object to do our grouping, and that's why you don't have that business object column. All these fields are directly coming from the primary business object of the report. And that's why, if you would have observed again, there's no subfilter tab, as because we use subfilters when we want to use fields from the RBOs as a filter criteria in a matrix report. Again, you don't have that subfilter option. All once again, I don't need any employees whose gender is. We only need employees whose gender is not empty. And it gets me that data. Now I can also define sub-level groupings. When we look at that row grouping section, when we look at this row grouping this section, it shows 8 items. Basically, we have 8 rows and the column grouping section has 2 rows. And there's no option. Unlike an advanced report, there's no option to add additional. In a row grouping, you can define 8 level of rows or 8 subgroups. And in column grouping, you can define a maximum of 2. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's say not just company, I also want to group my workers based on the country they belong to. A subgroup in rows, and I'm saying location, address, country. Let's run this report and then talk about it. Once again, same information. My overall count, this time we don't have blank employees. My overall count again doesn't change. Now the way I'm getting this data is in Jimizook. Country United Kingdom, there are 27 employees. And let's scroll down. Do we have Gyms or anywhere else? No, in Gyms, there are 152 employees. Whose company is Gyms and their work location is USA. There are 5 employees whose company is Gyms. USA and their work location is India. Based on the grouping parameters I defined, it is giving me output based on these two groups. And it again shows all permutations and combinations in terms of data. It still shows me all the values. Now this data doesn't make it's much. Certainly not structured correctly. I would expect all GMS USA to be listed together and countries under it. Now the reason it comes staggered is because of these sort rows options we have selected. It's sorted in a descending based on the row total. That combination, which has the highest number, comes first and on and forth. We would want to change this sorting. Or let's say I change this sorting and instead of row total descending there. Our other options is I can select row total ascending. I can select alphabetic ascending, alphabetic descending, and there are a couple of other options: logical sort, order and sequence defined in the streets. Look at that in a minute. If I select, let's say alphabetic ascending, let's see what happens. I get an error and the error says, you cannot have different sort orders for subgroups. All the groupings should have the same sort order. If I'm using alphabetic here, I should be using alphabetic here. The exception is if you're using that logical sort order or custom sort order, and look at that in a minute. Oh, now it gets sorted alphabetic ascending. I have. Switzerland and all countries within Switzerland and on and forth. In some situations, actually alphabetic sort order doesn't make sense. An example could be what could be an example? An example could be actually let's see what options are available. Thank you. Let's take age group and see it's actually a task called This is a task called maintain edge bands. We have this is fine. This would not make sense again. Let's take management level. In some cases, it makes more sense to sort data in logical fashion. Management level. Now my organization would be using different management levels. Let's say the first level is associate, and then we have senior associate, and then maybe consultant. Senior consultant manager, senior manager, and on and forth, and that is how I would want my data to be displayed now. In that case, selecting alphabetic order usually doesn't work. I would want my data to be displayed. Let's say CEO at the top. Below that we have EVPs and then VPs and then senior managers, senior consultants. In that case, when we select logical sort order, Workday would automatically sort our data logically based on those management level hierarchies that have been configured. In those scenarios, logical sort order makes sense. Again, this is a test tenant. I'm sure data there would be all sorts of unnecessary management levels. That may not really work here, but let's try. When we select, what did I select? When we select, currently it's alphabetic ascending. And Workday would sort it in an alphabetic ascending order. And that's what it is doing. One individual contributor and then manager. Now, of course, this is a test tenant. You'll have all sort of gibberish. But ideally, this is not how you'd want to sort your data. For instance, related objects. When you select logical sort order, then Workday automatically sorts them in a logical fashion. It is helpful for sorting objects, which have some logical sequence. But apart from that, you can also define your own custom sort order. If there's no logical order available for it for that object, if there's no logical order available, then you can also define your own custom sequence. You can come in here and select a sequence defined in the field value groups. What do I select? Let's say age group, because there are hundreds of management levels in the system. And I'm saying sequence defined in field groups. Once I do that, I'll have to specify the sequence. There's no sequence available because none have been. People have created some sequences, but I can go ahead and create a new sequence as I'm saying create field level groups. It would ask me, do I want to include blanks as obviously no employee would have, or some employee could have blank age groups if they don't have date of birth. I'm saying include blanks as, and then it shows me the instance, and then I can define my own sequence. I want 31 to 40 to come first, and then I want 21 to 30. This really allows us to define that custom sequence. But then you'll have to include all instances. If I save it, it will give me an error saying not all instances are in. Oh, there needs to be a field name as, let's call it age group. Let's see if it gives an error. It should. It has not given me an error. Let's see what output we get. You can define your own custom sequence. It is giving me data in that particular sequence. Now, in addition to, let's say, I have a requirement. I want to group data. Employees based on the companies they belong to. But if let's say they belong to US or Canada, I want to group them as GMS North America. If they belong to European companies, then I want to group them into Europe or the rest of the world. Now there's no such grouping available in Workday, at least in terms of organizations. And how do we create those groupings, custom groupings? For example, here employees are automatically grouped based on the age they belong to, but there is a standard task available to define this grouping. All it does is it checks, or here we are basically defining if employee belongs to age group 0 to 20. Then this is the band we want to group our employees in. And when we run our report, they check the bands defined here. And all our reports reference and use these bands. And that's why you see these 21 to 30. This is the configuration coming from here. But those kind of groupings, or at least standard tasks, are not available for the requirement that I'm stating now. In that case, we can create something called, we can create a calculate. Obviously, the calculate is called evaluate expression. Now there are two types of calculated fields when it comes to evaluate expression. One is evaluate expression band, and then we have evaluate expression. Both calc fields are quite similar with some differences. And explore both of those in terms of different use cases. I'm creating a new calculated field for report. There are two calculated fields. One is expression, band and expression. Let me select expression band first. And I'm calling it company grouping. Simultaneously, I would also show you how evaluate expression looks. If we look at how these calculates look, they look similar. Now these calculates allow you to define if-else conditions. It basically allows you to define a series of conditions. And if the condition is true, system returns the corresponding value. If your first condition is true, System returns the value defined here. If it fails, then system evaluates the next condition. Next condition, and on and forth. If none of the conditions are true, system assigns your instance to the default value that you define here. The moment it encounters a condition which is true for that instance, and conditions are evaluated top-down, the sequence is important. The moment it encounters a true condition, the instance is grouped in the corresponding bucket and your calculation ends. The same is the concept for evaluate expression as. Once again, you can define a series of conditions and return the corresponding value based on that. In that sense, both these calculated fields are same. Let's first create our evaluate expression band. My requirement is, if the employee belongs to, let's change our report and add company once again. Just want to see how many companies are there based on our filter. If the employee belongs to us or Canada, I want to group them under North America. To build my first condition now, condition we already know is a calculated field of type true or false. Boolean, I'm creating a new calculated field which is of type true false. Field, I'll just say is North America. My condition reads if the company is. I will copy the companies from here. We need to add for a given employee, if this condition is true, that means if they belong to GMMs. US or Canada, I want to return this value for that employee. Oh, what did I do? I'll simply say company grouping. I think the other calc field would be created already. Yes, if it is North America, I want to group them or return this value called North America else. I am building my next condition. Let's say EU. Tools. Comp. We'll take Switzerland and Norway here. It will not use UK. Then I'm calling it Europe. Else, I'll call it rest of world. All I'm doing is creating these buckets. Now, when I come back, and that's a I'm calling it regions. And now that is strange. No, this is perfectly fine. I think the reason is this one. Currently, only indexed fields can be used. And when we build our call fields, they are not indexed. This is when, even though your data source is indexed, you may still want to use, or you may still have to use, some call fields which are non-indexed. Especially or some fields which are not indexed, and that is when you would want to unselect. That checkbox optimized for performance. Now once again, my overall count is still the same. 223, it's grouping employees based on into different brackets based on the grouping. I have defined all you can use evaluate expression band to create any custom groups. All now evaluate expression band, as I mentioned, is very similar to evaluate. Expression. Now, what is the difference? The difference is when I edit this report and this. Calculate. This is how it looks, whereas if I go here. Once again, I can let me create a cal build for report that we will be able to leverage. I want to create a new calc field now. Which is evaluate XP. Question calling it manager. Managers, among all these workers that I have, and there are 223, I want to know how many of these workers are managers. I want to get a count of managers in each of these companies. Now, how do we do that? For that, if you see I need to get a count, what I need is a number. Now with respect to evaluate expression, the return values are always, if you see, a text, though I can add a number 1, 2, 3 or whatever, but it is still considered a text. Here I can still use the same conditions. If I go in here, we see I can still use the same conditions, but the return value is currently grayed out. With evaluate expression, I have the flexibility or the option to decide what type of value I want to return. And I would do that by selecting the field type. Here I have the option of selecting what type do I want to return. If I select numeric when I go in here and click on all, what should I enter? Let's see. If you see, it's only giving me either numeric or currency related values. That's because I've selected the return type as numeric. This easier way to check that, when I go in here and look at the global fields, if I go to global fields, it's only giving me the option to select numeric global fields. However, if I change it to text or change it to date or any corresponding value now, if you see, it only allows me to return text related values. Evaluate expression gives me that added flexibility to decide what type of value I want to return. Now let's say I want to return. If I wanted, I could have created this cal field using evaluate expression by selecting text here and returning text value. But in that case, in the case of evaluate expression, you cannot directly type in, for example. Here I was able to type not America. This is simple text in this case. I cannot do that. I'll have to return a value in terms of a field. I would have had to create a new calculated field of type text constant. Even if I have to return North America as the value based on this condition, I'll have to go in here, create cal field for the report, select text constant, I'm just calling it again. This is the name. The actual value is what I define here, and then enter North America here. If you want to build an evaluate expression which returns you text, then it is sensible to use evaluate expression band itself instead, and that's what I do. If you want to return numeric values or any other type of values, then use the evaluate expression man. If you see, it saved me the trouble of creating 3 calculated fields, else I would have created one here, one here, one here. That's the benefit of using expression band. Now I don't need this. My use case is to get the count of managers. That's what I want. All select numeric. And my condition is there's a Workday delivered condition. A Boolean field is manager. I'll select that. It indicates if the employee is a manager. If yes, it will return true. If not, it will return false. If the person is a manager, I want this calcul to return 1 if the person is else. That is the only condition I want to check. If the person is not a manager, I want this calcul to return 0. That's all my calcul does. For each worker, it checks if the person is a manager. If he or she is, it returns 1. Else it returns 0. Now my requirement is to get the overall count of managers. I want to define that summarization. For that, I'll not use this call field here. I've just created it here. I would go down. Go to my summarizations. I'll keep the summarization as is. I'm going to add a new summarization. And summarization is sum. There are others as and have a look. And I want to basically sum this. And if you see, that's the only calculate it returns. Even though there are other calculated fields I have created. That's because this is the only calculate which is numeric. And I can only sum numeric values. This is how it works. If a person is a manager, this calculate returns 1. If not, it returns 0. And with this sum, I'm simply adding. Every instance either returns 1 or 0, and this sum simply adds them together. Ultimately, it counts all managers because only managers return a value. Everyone else returns 0. Again, by leveraging these calc fields, you can deliver. Or handle a lot of requirements. You just have to understand how a calc field can be used and leveraged. Let's see what output this calc field gives me. There are 2 employees in European Union. None of them is a manager. 6 males, overall 21 are managers. And out of overall 223, the total column 30 are managers. 20 are male managers, 9 female, and no managers in this list. Can I validate and confirm? At least at point in time, I cannot. When I click on any of these numbers, it gives me the count 126. And when I click here again, it gives me the overall count in that section, which is 126. I want to validate my data. And how do I do that? I want to understand if these numbers are correct. The values that you see here or in this pop-up is the default. Detailed data, it is simply showing you those instances that the data source returns. But what I can actually do is I can go ahead and edit this and add my own detailed data. I would edit my report. This is this tab called Drill Down. Let's click on this tab. Talk about this. Section in a bit. For now, I want to add detailed data. The first column I want to add is worker. Now, This is similar to the advanced reports that we created, the only exception being I can only select fields from my primary business object. But apart from that, just an advanced report, I can now add any fields that I want to. I can still extract detailed data from a matrix report if I want. I want to add that if the person is a master, manager or not, I'll add that Boolean field. If the person is a manager, it will return yes, else it will return no. I'm adding a few other fields. For example, I'm adding age. I am adding length of service and on and forth. I can pull any of the calculated fields. Or delivered fields which are available on the worker business object and show them here. This time when I run this report, it would make a lot more sense. And I would in fact be able to validate data. When I run it, the overall output is still the same. I'm still getting those numbers. But this time, when I click on those numbers, it is giving me a lot more information. This time it gives me the worker name, the position, if that person is a manager, age and on and forth. How many managers are there in this count of 126? There are 21. Let's take a smaller number. That would be easy. Here, out of 14, there are 1 man. There is 1 manager in the rest of the world. If I sort it in descending order, there's just 1 manager and we can go to the profile and see if that person has a manager role or not. That means my calculation is working fine. That's how I can validate or add detailed data on my report. Now, not just that, there are some other options available. Let's take a bigger number. I'll click on this overall count of 2 to 23. This gives me 23 employees at the top. I have these view by options. What I can do is I can select this drop down. Now I want to view these 223 employees that are listed based on, let's say, their age group. And I can then select a different parameter, but let's take just one. And when I refresh, it is showing me data for those 223 workers. The count is 223 based, and out of that again 30 are managers. That's what we see based on the age group they belong to. There are 72 in the age group 51 to 60. And I want to see who are the age group. Those 72. I can again click on that number and it would give me the details of those 72 employees. I want to group them based on, let's say, another parameter. I want to group them based on their, let's say, location, and when I refresh, they are spread across 16 locations, the overall 72 employees, and once again I want to who are these 20 workers in Dallas? And then again view this information by a different parameter and on and forth. I can view this data based on any of these grouping parameters. Now we didn't define these grouping parameters. They are available by default based on the data source we created. Now, in certain cases, you don't want your end users to have access to. Maybe or some of these groupings, then you can restrict them. By default, all groupings are available or drill down options are available. If you want, you can restrict the drill down options for your end users and you do that. There are two ways to actually access it. Once by clicking on once a one is the way we saw it by clicking on the number. But then if you click on this arrow, which pops up on the side, it shows you the options directly here. Instead of clicking on the number, I could have directly viewed this information based on the range group. Any which ways, let's edit our report. I'll go to the drill down tab. Earlier we added detailed data. In terms of drillable fields, all the default fields are available. I want to restore the drillable fields, let's say only to age group. This is where I can restrict and maybe let's say management level. There are a number of fields. Make sure that you select the one if you're doing it for. The first time you'll have to go to the description and see which one makes sense. And I can select any other option. Let's say I want to do it based on the job profile. And I can add any other reliable fields that I want. This time when I run my report, and look at the options. You see, there are just 3 options. If I go to the count as and look at the view options, there again, the options are restricted to what were added. Now there's one problem with the drilling still. If I click on this number, let's say 14 here in males, it shows me those 40 individuals. Who belong to rest of the world. Now, ideally, what I would expect is when I click on this number 1, it gives me that one. But that doesn't happen. It still gives me those 14. Basically, what is happening is in this. It is, if you see, it is internally still evaluating those 40 instances through our calculation. It's just that if a given instance is true, in the sense if a given instance is a manager, we returned 1. If the person is not a manager, we returned 0. And we simply added it. But this matrix ultimately is still evaluating in this case. For example, those 40 employees. Or in this case, it still evaluated those 110 employees. And then gave us the result 20 because only 20 were managers. That's why it's still returning us that count however went in. And the same is the case if you click anywhere. If I click here, it will give me 3. Here it will still give me 193 and on and forth. Now how to remedy this? For that, I'll have to create a detailed data override. The drill down tab that we have on the report. It allowed us to define detailed data for the entire report. In the sense, if I add any number of new summarizations, as currently we have 2 summarizations, these 2. If I add any new summarizations, they would say still refer when I click on them. I would still get the details based on what I've defined at the report level, but in this case it's not working for us because it's not giving us the output that we are expecting here for this particular column or this particular summarization. I would want to override the drill down values or the detailed data. I'll go to options. I'll go to create and I'll create a detailed data override. I'll create a detailed data override. This is similar to what we did there. I can go in here and add the columns. Now just to differentiate it from the overall detailed data that we did. And just to show you the difference. Here I would just add 2 columns. But again, you can add the same set of columns if you want to. I'll just add one more column as manager, which will again allow us to validate if our log is fine. This is fine. It shows us the columns that would be displayed when we click on that number. But still, how do we restrict it to only those 20 rows? For example, 20 rows who are managers. When I scroll down, I have this option which says instances to display. Currently, it's showing all instances. That's what I mentioned. It's still showing you all 110 instances. Now there are of options here. One option is instances where the fields to summarize is not equal to 0. Now this is what we would want here. If you see, we are summarizing. We have created that. Cult field. If the person is a manager, the cult field returns 1. If an instance is not a manager, it returns 0. What all I need to do is only select or include those instances where the fields to summarize are not equal to 0, and in our case, only managers return a non-zero value. Everyone else returns a 0 value. Now, this looks stuck. Create detailed data override. I want those who know. Instead of this, I could have also selected the other option. Set instances where the condition is true. And what condition is if the person is a manager? In this case, it really doesn't matter if we use this option or this option. I can just say only show me those instances where this condition is true, which means the person is manager. Or I can select this option as, but there would be certain cases where selecting this option wouldn't work, and you'll have to select this. You'll have to basically select a condition. For example, let's say I want to show when you click on that number. Let's say I want you to show only those employees who are non-managers, which means if you click here, let's say, this one non-managers. Now, how would you do that in that case? The new true-false condition. Saying his manager is false and then use it here. I hope that makes sense. In that case, selecting this option wouldn't work because for managers it returns 1, non-managers it is non-managers. In that case, the only option for you would be create a new calcul of type true false. Saying is this person not a manager and then use that field here as I mentioned in our case. In this scenario, I can just select this option, which I need to add columns. I'm just adding 2 columns, the name of the worker and his manager. This time, when I run this report, I still get the same output, which is what we expect. But in terms of clicking on this number now, it gives me only those person who are managers. Or we can define detailed data override for any of our summarizations. Or let's look at just thinking of some. Something small, which we can cover in 10 minutes before we go for our break. In addition to this, as I mentioned, there are a number of other summarizations as, for example, let me remove gender else it becomes very busy and difficult to understand. I want to get, let's say, the maximum age of employees and you see it's you don't have to build any complex logic. It's this simple. You want to get, let's say, the minimum length of service of the employee. And on and forth. Maybe you want to get the average age of employees or average, let's say, total waste pay amount. And you can define your format whatever you want. There are quite a few summarizations, and you can leverage them based on your requirement. It's giving me the maximum age of the workers. Let's quickly click here. There are 3 employees. The maximum age of these 3 workers is 42. Similarly, it's for these 3 workers. It's giving me the minimum length of service again if I go here. Or does it show me this is in months, 17 months, which is this is the worker, 12 plus 5, 17. You don't have to build any complex logic. It's as simple as using that. Summarization and type and then specifying the field that has to be summarized. Or there are a few more. Summarization types that we would talk about. Look at percentages. Talk about. One more calculated field. Then also look at the charts and graphs. Any questions till now? All if there are no questions. We were talking about the summarizations and there are a few different types of summarizations that we can add now. Let's go back to that requirement. We have the overall count. We have the count of managers. I need the count of non-managers. Now, how can I do that? And do that by creating a custom summarization or a calculation summarization. Of all these summarizations that are available, we can also add a summarization of type calculation. Or I can also add a summarization of type calculation now. Basically, excuse me, how would I get the non-managers count? I would take the overall count from it, subtract managers. That's what will get me the count of non-managers. For that, I can select the summarization type of calculation. And there's nothing else I can actually do in. Over here, I could have done it the other way as in terms of creating a new calculated field. The way we check using this evaluate expression if the person is a manager. Then we were returning 1 else. We were returning 1, 0. I could have created a new calc field which would have been the reverse of what we did here. If the person would have been a non-manager, I would have returned 1 else, return 0. That would have done the trick for me, but still, we can also do that without creating an actual calculated field using this summarization type. I can come in here and I can create, in terms of summarizations, the same logic. I can create summarization specific for this report, or I can create a system-wide summarization. I'm saying create summarization specific for the report. The name is non-managers and I'm creating a summarization calculation. Basically, what I want is I want to take the count of all the instances this field. And I have various operators available at minus, subtract, divide, multiply, and from that I want to subtract. Be this one, and how did we achieve this? We basically thank you. Calculation. Create summarization calculation for report. You can count from that. I want to subtract basically the sum of this. This is exactly what we did for this particular column. We were taking the sum of all the managers and subtracting it from the overall count. Now I'll select this, and if we use other operators, for example divide, multiply, then we may want to use the rounding function, round up or round down. And there are multiple options available. These are all delivered options, and we can use whatever is relevant for us. Let's run our report now. A 27 minus 1, it's giving me a count of non-managers. That's what we wanted. At times it makes sense to use the summarization calculation. That is much more easier than creating a calculated field. Any questions till now? At times we also have a need to get percentages. And for that, all we need to do is there are a few options with respect to deriving percentages. I'll remove all of these. I'll also add gender because then it would make a bit more sense. Since I'm still getting the count, but all I have to do is I'll have to specify the format as percentage, and there are lots of options available. And if I have to get a percentage, I can select any of the available options. I'm selecting the one with a decimal. Let's run this and see how the output looks and what options are available to then correct the output. The output actually doesn't make sense. It says that there are 2 males. And it gives me a percentage of 200. One female percentage is 100. And oral count is 3. And the percentage is 300%. This certainly doesn't make sense. When using percentages, we have to select one of the available options within that summarization. Now I'll go ahead and fix this. When I edit this, scroll down. When I've selected the format as a percentage under options, I get a few options. I can show the percentage in terms of the column, total row, total overall total. Let's first select column total and see how it looks. Now when I go back, and this looks much better. Now what is happening is because we selected percentage of column total, all percentages are being calculated in terms of the total for that column, which means the column total is considered 100%. 126 is the overall 100%, out of which 110 males. Are in North America, which is 8. 2 males are in European Union, which is 1.6%. Again in this column female there are 94. The count is 94, which is 100%. All these percentages are being calculated in terms of the total for that column. The same is the case here. 3 people, 2 in North America, 66%. And same is the case here. The column total is considered 100%. And all percentages are being derived in terms of that column total. Instead of that, if I select row total, then my row total is considered 100%, and then all totals will be derived in terms of that row total. Let me quickly edit show that. I can say show me the percentage in terms of row total. And now my row total becomes 100%. Overall 3 people in U, which is 100%. 2 are male, 66%, and 1 is female. Similarly, 27 in rest of the world, which is 100%, all percentages are being calculated in terms of row total. And then there's a third option as which is percentage of overall total, wherein my overall total is considered 100% and all totals are being will be calculated in terms of that overall total. It all depends on your business requirements. If you have to derive percentages, what would you want to derive? That's what would determine what you actually select. Now my overall total is considered 100%. Only this is 100% and every other percentage is being calculated in terms of this. Overall, all now, I want to group my employees, let's say, based on the month. In which they were hired, if they were hired in, or maybe the year in which they were hired. I want to group my employees based on one or the year in which they were hired things with you. Can you guys hear me fine? Or this? An issue. I see my connection is unstable. Evaluate expression band or evaluate expression. But in this case, I still want to group my employees, but based on the month or the year or the quarter in which they were hired, or let's say they were born. That's how I want to create my grouping now. For that, I wouldn't be using evaluate expression, because that would become tedious. I'll have to create an if condition saying if hired in, let's say 25 to 2021 2022 and on and forth. That would be n number of permutations, n number of calculations that I'll have to do. There's a better way to handle this requirement, and this comes very handy, especially in recruitment. I built many reports. For example, you want to count the application locations based on the week they were in. They were candidates applied. You want to determine the candidate pipeline over weeks. You want to then group your candidates based on the week in which they applied for that job. How do we create this grouping for date? We do that by creating a calculated field, and because this is date related, the calculated field would be of type date. The function is format date. I am calling it hire quarter. Let's say I want to group my employees based on the quarter. They were hired. I'll take the parameter. In this case, I'm taking the hire date. The other example I gave, I want to count the number of applications each week or each month. Then my date field would be the application date. In this case, I'm taking hire date. And all I need to do is basically, from the hire date, I'm extracting maybe the year, the quarter, the month, whatever is required. I'm saying from the hire date, extract the quarter and the year, and there are different options available. I could have selected, for example, week, which gives me some additional options. Let's first build with week and then change it, and I can say what are the display options. I'm selecting date range for now. All I'm doing is I'm taking the hire date, and from that I'm extracting the week in which the hire date falls, and then I'm basically each employee falls in a given week with based on when the employee was hired, and then I'm using that as a grouping. Now when I run it, because I said group employees based on the week they uh, and show me the range. It shows me the range. This employee was hired in this week, or 56 males were hired in this week, and they are all grouped together. I could have said, just show me the week start date. It shows me a range because I selected the option week date range. I could have said just week start date or weekend date, and on and forth. Instead of that, let's say I say quarter and year, save it, and we run my report. Thank you. Now my employees again faces workers hired in quarter 1 of 2000. And on and forth. I can create or use this format date calc field to basically format any date. If I have to show date in a specific format in an advanced report. But then it is also used when we want to do groupings based on dates. And that is relevant for matrix reports. I can also define a custom formatting. Apart from these delivered formats which are available, and there are quite a few, I can move to the end, and there's this option called Format Mask, and when I click here, it will show me the options. If Y stands for year, for example, let's say I want to create a format mask of MIM by YN. Let me click. And this time again, it should give me the output in terms of month and year in which the person was hired. That's how I'm getting my data. That was a format date calculated field. Now this information looks fine in the form of a table, but if you remember the dashboard, we saw the other day, it had those graphs. What do is go ahead and edit this report and try adding some of those graphs. If we come to the Output tab, now we saw this tab yesterday when we enabled our report as a worklet. But then there's this additional option to specify the output type, the D for output. Output type is stable, but I want to show the output in terms of both chart as a stable. Or I could have just selected chart. Now it opens up additional options within chart. Look at that. For now, let's run this report. When I do that, this time it shows me the date. The layout in terms of a chart. This is column clustered. Change the field, this grouping. Doesn't make sense, but that's fine. Now if I want, I can select a different chart type. I can also expand certain area. This area is quite small. I can click on it and that particular section would get expanded. But then I can. The default chart that the system is displaying is column clustered. If I want, I can dynamically select a different chart type as but then there are some additional chart options. The options that are displayed depend on the chart type that you select. First thing, let's change the grouping. And then look at those chart type options. As I mentioned, the options that are displayed here depends on the type of chart you select. The default chart type enabled is column clustered. If I want, I can select any of the other options and have a look at that. Now here I can decide how do I want to visualize my data. Here the horizontal grouping, horizontal axis. It is showing row grouping. And we know on the row grouping we have company this time. I can decide if that's what I want or I want to, for example, show the column grouping. On the horizontal axis and our column grouping is the gender similarly on the legend. I can decide what grouping I want. I can, for example, say, select column grouping on the legend. And then I can say what metrics should be included. What are these metrics? Metrics 1 is the first summarization. This is my matrix 1. This is my matrix 2. This is my matrix 3 and this is my matrix 4 when I select if you see on the legend, I select matrix. I have the option to include all 4 metrics, the options. You select determines the layout of the chart. And there are a number of positions and combinations. You can actually try to see what layout works best for your requirement. Let's take this bit. My horizontal axis is now the row grouping. On the legend of taking the column. And 70 females and on and forth. My legend is the column grouping. Now there are some additional options that I can enable. For example, I can show a dual chart, a combo chart which is usually displayed or which can be built in an Excel. I can also configure it here if I want. For example, I want the count of employees. Employees, which is what I'm showing now as matrix 1, but I also want to show the count of managers, or let's say the percentage of managers. My matrix 1 is count of employees. And my matrix 3 is the count of managers. What I can do is, again, as I mentioned, the options that you see depend on the chart type you select and how you decide or what you want to show on horizontal axis or legend and on and forth. But then there's this option called secondary axis. I am enabling this axis, and here I want to include my matrix 3. What is my matrix 3? The count of managers. While I'm taking the count of employees or overall count, I'm also showing the count of managers on the secondary axis. And here I want to show this as, let's say, a line. And now when I click, this is what it was showing me earlier. Just the count of employees. This time when I go back, I have enabled a secondary axis. And this time on the hand side. If you see, my secondary axis is displayed, which is basically the count of managers. And we said, show that as a line. In GMS, you say there are 70 managers who are male. And there are 9 managers who are female. And there are 0 managers without disclosing their gender. The overall employee count is displayed as a bar out of 96 male employees, and that is shown on the left-hand side. I can display these kind of combo charts as. Now, this is legend. This is the count. I have the option, for example, to hide these counts, to hide these legends. We don't have an option to actually change the color. That is Workday. And if I click on the legend here, it highlights that. If I click here, it actually highlights only that bit. Which looks good. Again, as I mentioned, I have other options as. For example, I can go to advanced options. I can give a name. My horizontal axis is. Company, the vertical axis is a worker count, and my secondary axis is a manager count. Under options, I don't want to show these totals which display here. I can come in here and say do not display chart totals. I can even hide legends if I want to. In addition to this, I can also show something called a target line. I can come in here. Many times we want to specify a target. For example, let's say that if I'm showing a chart displaying the proportion of my male, or let's say the proportion of managers across genders, and let's say the minimum target is 10%, and then system shows me the target line, and then I can see what is the percentage of managers in, among males, among females, and is it above or below the target line I can display. one target line for all groups, or based on the option, we can also display multiple target lines. But because we have a secondary axis that is not being displayed, and then I can select some field. In this case, let's say my target is probably, I don't know, n again, it doesn't make sense in this case. But I'm just taking a random and I'm giving it a label. Let's say target percentage. And that target line can be defined. If you see, you can define it in terms of any number, any percentage, any dynamic field as. Now it shows me that target again. This the reason it's showing me two target lines is because I selected 10 as the target. For the left hand side, the value 10 is here. And on the right hand side, it's here. I can use this target line, which is again a visualization. And it allows me to understand what values about target. What values below target? As I mentioned, it doesn't make sense for our use case here. But if we want, we can show that target line on our report. And again, it shows me the title of my horizontal axis, my left-hand axis, my secondary axis, and that overall count is now no longer displayed. As I mentioned, the options that you see would depend on the chart type. For example, if I, let's say, select chart type which is donut, it doesn't give me all these options because on a donut chart we cannot include multiple metrics. It really depends on the type of chart you select, but also how you show your horizontal axis, vertical axis. Based on those permutations and combinations, you'll see different options being enabled. You'll have to. Basically, if you're trying to achieve something, you'll have to do. Try out different options and see how it looks. For example, the moment I select bar, obviously, I don't have that option of selecting horizontal axis, vertical axis. And on a donut, I can just include one matrix. I cannot include more than one matrix within donut. However, under advanced, it gives me a few other options. For example, I can show percentages on the pie slices. I can show values on the pie slices. Your chart type determines what options are enabled. In my experience, I usually use a donut and a column clustered. I don't think I've had a requirement, or I really build other types of charts, but you can. You may need to build those. It's giving me based on the options selected. If it's giving me the percentages on these slices and also the numbers on the slices, this is that. Additional option enabled for donut chart. That was questions. Also look at trending reports tomorrow. They are, as I mentioned, very similar to a matrix report. Just I think, 3 differences, 3, that's all. All that was output. Now again, the other options are similar. I can go to prompts again, populate undefined prompt defaults. Basically the same options we have been looking at. We didn't look at or we did look at Advanced tab, Optimize for Performance. We already know what that is. There are a couple of other options now when I'm including a report in a dashboard. I don't want this report to be accessible outside a dashboard. In that case, what I can do is I can enable this checkup. Box exclude execution link from search, and when we do that, not be able to search, even if you have access to it when you search for it. System will not return you any results, and as I mentioned, the basic idea is, let's say you have included that report in a dashboard and you don't want it to be searchable. The other use case is, if you remember, we discussed about composite report, wherein matrix reports or one or multiple matrix reports can be or are included into composite reports. In that case, your matrix reports are actually sub-reports which feed into a composite report. You don't want your matrix report itself to be searchable. Then you'll again go ahead and hide or exclude your reports from the search option. There's one more option, enable save parameters, and both these options are available for all report types. It's just that we didn't discuss them in the context of an advanced report. But if you open your advanced report, these two options are available there as. Along with this, there are a couple more options that are available there. First, let's look at enable save parameters. This basically when you are running the report multiple times with, let's say, the same prompts. This basically allows you to save your prompt parameters just makes it easy for end users. Let's run it from here. It should have given me. It's not giving me here. Let's run it here. Let me see. It opens up this new section. And the advantage is, and it really doesn't make sense in this case, but in some reports where there are a lot of prompts, and if I have to enter each prompt explicitly every time, it's much more easier if, as an end user, I go ahead and save those prompt parameters. Let's say I'm running this report for regular and maybe interns. What I can do is I can go ahead and save this prompt parameter employee types, and I can go ahead and save it, and I can actually save multiple prompt parameters. For example, I want to save another prompt parameter for, let's say, contingent workers consultant. Contractor, and I'm saving it as contractors, save. Now, when I run this report, I have those prompt parameters saved, which means I can quickly select them. And my prompts get added. It makes it easy for me to search and run my report. As I mentioned, let me search for KPMG2. When I do that, if you see, it's giving me 3 results. This is our advanced report, which we created yesterday. And this is our matrix report which we just created. Now for this matrix report, it's only giving me one result. For this, it's giving me two results. Now, the reason for this is I have basically selected that option exclude from search criteria. This one is actually the report definition. And the reason I'm able to search for report definition is because I am a report writer. This is basically the technical part and the report. Let's see the difference. When I click on report definition, it actually opens the definition. And when I click on report, this is that report definition, which opens the definition. And this is actual execution link. And it executes. The reason I'm not getting that report for matrix report is because I have excluded it from the search as an end user. I'll not have a report. Writer access. Which means obviously I'll not get the report definition. And because the report is hidden from search, I'll not get any results. This is basically the admin access, because of which I'm able to see the report definition as an owner. But this is what happens when you basically hide the report. As I mentioned, even for an advanced report, those options are applicable. And there are just a couple more options available on an advanced report. I still have that enable, say parameters exclude, enable exclusion link. I have freeze first column as, and when I do that, my first column is frozen. This is again your Excel function. I also have an option called enable preferred currency. I believe you guys would have covered this in your week 1 training your basics. Basically, I have an option to see compensation data in my preferred currency. For example, let's say IM. Let's pick some employees from this, from UK, and see their composition. Let's see some workers from UK. What happens is if I have enabled the option, I have enabled the option. If you see the actual compensation of this worker is in GBP, obviously the worker is working from UK, but then I can also see the conversion in terms of US dollars. 20,000 GBP to the US dollars. And it also shows me that conversion that is working. It says 1 GBP is 1.8 US dollars. This is the preferred currency of the user. I'm logged in as. When I enable this option on the report, it also allows me to view the data in terms of my preferred currency on the report, else it's not available on the report that option to view preferred currency. I can enable a preferred currency. The web service options. This is not relevant for us in the sense, not for this class. What happens? Is we can enable a report as a web service. Web service is used or can be used to send or receive. Send data from Workday to a third-party system or receive data from a third-party system into Workday. You can enable a report as a web service and then that report can act as a data source. Into an integration. For that again, you just have to enable your report as a web service. It leads to some additional requirements on the report. For example, you have to define web service alias for each of your columns or fields. But it's as simple as that. Once you do that, then your report can be consumed by an integration, an EID or a Studio integration, or any other integration. This time when I run this report, there's no data. I don't know why there's no data. But again, basically, all we have done is we have frozen the first column. This is that comment. Excel function that we used any questions this time if I search for keeping to do. You'll see that it wouldn't return me 3 options. It will only return me 2 options. I'm just seeing the report definition, not the actual execution link. All any questions till now? I'll take that as a no. We've covered drill down. This one more option that we can also disable drilling on our report. What I can also do is when it comes to drilling, I can actually disable. I can come in here, come to drill down. And I have the drill down options. Many times because of maybe data privacy requirements. You would be asked, or there would be a need, to disable all drilling or all detailed data. There are 2 options. The first one is disable all drilling for the drill report, and as the name suggests, it will then prevent me from clicking on any of those numbers. To get the detailed data, let's quickly now my numbers are not drillable. There's a second option as which is disable, drilling to details. If I go to drill down, there's a second option which is disable, drill to details for. the report, and when I select this option, it does allow me to drill. But then when I run this now, my drilling is enabled. But normally when I click on this, it shows me when I click on any of these numbers. It actually shows me detailed data, the worker name, whatever fields we have added. And then we have the option to look at that information in terms of this view by options. But now when I click on these numbers, I don't see any detailed data. All I do is I select or view that data by the view by option. It selects the first view by option by default. And that's all. I don't have the option to see any detailed data. And the reason is we have set disable. Disable the release. To details, we have basically disabled viewing the detail options. We have defined some detailed data overrides. That's fine. There are two options with respect to disabling the drilling. Let's see what else left. Filters the prompt options. We have covered output. Share looked at advanced as if there are no questions, we can move to the next report type, which is trending reports. Now, as I mentioned, trending reports are very similar to a matrix report. The difference between a trending report and a matrix report. This report is giving me data as of now. As of now, this is the count of employees in different companies. I can get data for a time period using this report. Report using matrix report by creating that date format. If you see that way I'm getting data in some form of period saying Rex employees were hired in period in week 1 or month 1 or quarter 1 X employees, where the count of employees hired in quarter 2 is YN. On and forth, we created that cult field which allowed us to get some sense of time period. But if I want to get actual trends, let's say the terminations, or the attrition count, or the hire count, or the head count of my employees over a period of time, then we create trending reports. Now, trending reports, as I mentioned, is similar to a matrix report with just 3 key differences. That's fine, don't worry about this error. We just have to disable one of those options. Create custom report. Thank you. The report type is trending. The first difference between a matrix report and a trending report is that for trending report, Workday has delivered a specific data source. That data source is called trended workers. For trending report, Workday has delivered this specific data source. Now, if you look at the definition of any data source, what does it say? Let's look at this data source. It says this data source has access to the data source. This is the worker as its primary business object. And for each worker, it returns one row. If my organization has 100 workers, this data source returns 100 rows. Specifically, this data source would include active and terminated workers based on the filters we have selected. For each worker record, this data source returns one row. Let's look at the trended workers data source. If I go in here, again, this data source is also built on the worker business. Work, the actual business object is stranded worker, but fine, it still assesses worker as its primary business object. But the difference is, instead of returning one row for each worker, it returns multiple rows for each worker. For each worker, this data source returns multiple instances. Now, what are those instances? It returns multiple rows of activity and snapshot data. What is snapshot or what is activity? Activity is basically the transactions that have happened on the worker. I was hired in January. That's one activity. A change job happened for me in March. That's another activity in December. I was terminated. In between, I was promoted, transferred, demoted. It basically tracks all your staffing transactions for each worker. This data source, it stores not just one row for each worker record. Instead, for each worker record, it stores one row for each transaction. And when I say transaction, these staffing transactions, it doesn't mean it stores, for example, if the worker name changes, or it doesn't store non-staffing staffing transactions. It stores all activity data and it also stores the snapshot data. What is snapshot? It is simply the status of that worker or as of that period. In the month of Jan, it returns two records. One is the activity record. I was hired in Jan and my snapshot is I am a headcount in that organization in Feb. No transaction happened, but it still returns one record for me because I'm still active for each period, and we can select period. It would be a month, or it would be a quarter, or it could be a year. It stores or it returns all activities during that period as is my single snapshot. Whether I'm active or terminated, it returns multiple rows for each worker, both activity and snapshot. Only includes worker activity and snapshot data for the last 36 months. At any given point in time, it can only store data for a maximum of 36 months, which is 3 years. This data source actually refreshes in the background at regular intervals, whereas all other data sources, data is available instantaneously. You hire an employee and you immediately run report. That employee is picked in that report, but with respect to trended workers data source, it actually runs in the background regular intervals, and then it collects that data. There are some default prompts and that's it. there are some default prompts available on the data source. This data source is delivered by Workday specifically for creating trending reports. Let's call it KMG2. Headcount trend. Now this data source and this business object actually has some unique fields which are not available in any other business object. The first difference between a matrix report and a trending report is the data source that we select. And these are the filters which are available. Next, just a matrix report. If you see, there is a column grouping option, a section for summarizations, and the options are same as we saw earlier. But then there is no row grouping. What is the specific function of? Which means one of the grouping parameters is always time period. One of the groupings is time period because it gets you data for time period. Now, why is that I don't see that? If you see, one of the parameters is time period and I can show data on a quarterly basis, a yearly basis, or a monthly basis. I want to show data on a quarterly basis. That's my grouping that I'm doing for the time period. And by default, my time period shows on the rows. My row grouping is the time period. I can decide to show it on column, and when I do that, you will see this changes. And now I have to specify my row grouping, which is actually required. I can show time period as my row grouping, which is the default option. And then column grouping is optional. For example, I can show gender as my column grouping or any other parameter, and I can also relabel my row grouping. In that sense, this is similar to my matrix report. Just a matrix report, I define row grouping, which is required. And then there is an optional column grouping. The only difference is in here. One of those grouping parameters is time period because we are showing trend over a period of time. Again, I can define the summarization type. Now what did I say? Count returns. Let's first run this report and then see what data your count returns. With a lot of default prompts. These two are required, I would. It's giving me unusually high numbers. It's giving me in terms. It's giving me 14,000 instances in, for example, last quarter of 2022, and we know overall. There are, I think, 7,000 employees in our tenant. 7 or 8,000, then why is it? Why is this count giving me this higher number? Remember the discussion we had with respect to matrix report earlier when we started. What does count do? Count simply counts the instances that are returned by your data source. Now we looked at the description of the data source. For each worker, it returned multiple instances. It basically holds all activities that have happened for each worker in a given quarter, plus a snapshot. That's why using count, though that option is available, it actually doesn't make sense on a track. Ending report. If I click on this number as an example, and this would make sense as to what it is counting or what data that data source stored. Visit 2008, the person was hired, it is showing. A snapshot for each month in a quarter. There should be actually 3 values. But if you see for each worker, it is showing multiple values. And if we scroll down, it would also show the activities. Some activity has happened on this worker. This worker was terminated, which is again an activity. And it's also a function. It is showing for this for each month. The minimum granularity at which this data source stores data is at the month level. And see that in the configuration when we have a look. And that's why, as I mentioned, using count itself doesn't make sense on a trended report. The next thing, if here I have talk about that a bit, what actually makes sense on a trending report is to use these specific fields that have been designed for this report. I mentioned a while ago that there are some unique fields that have been delivered for this data source, which are not available anywhere else. And if I take some, and for example, I want to get the count of hire. This is the activities I'm tracking. Hire is an activity, termination is an activity, promotion is an activity, transfer is an activity. And these are fields which are only available on this data, on this business object and data source. Similarly, I want to get the termination count, and within termination you can track voluntary terminations, involuntary terminations. These are all delivered. These are all fields which are delivered as part of this data source. You don't have to build those calculations. Similarly, we have promotion count and host of other fields that are available. Promotion count, transfer in, count, transfer out count, and on and forth. This field called headcount. Let's run this report now. Now this makes a lot more sense. And this is how I can understand this. This is actually the snapshot as of the end of that period. This is some of the activities that we are tracking. For example, at the end of quarter 1 of 2021, there were 346 employees. Let's take this, it would be easier. At the end of quarter 3 of 2021, there were 405 employees, 43 were hired, 25 were terminated. Plus there could be other activities as maybe someone Some employees were transferred into this organization, 43 minus 25, which is 18 overall. Between hire and termination, there are 18 additions, and if I add at the end of quarter 3, my count was 225, 18 new additions to it, which takes my overall count to 4,200. 223, there were no transfers, no terminations in that quarter. Again, 427 people were. Higher were terminated, 4 were promoted, probably someone transferred, and that gives me this count. This is the snapshot as of that period or as of the end of that period, and this is the activity or some of those activities which we are displaying on our report. If I go back, I can also, when I'm running this report, I can decide for which record type I want to pull. If I say I only want to see the snap, and now when I run this report, it only gives me the ending head count because that is the snapshot as of that period. Or I can, if I say only get me activity data, and now it only gives me activity data. A trending report, one of the parameters, and we selected quarter. We could have selected year or month. One of the parameters, as I mentioned, is the time period. I could have selected another grouping parameter for my columns, and again, my output would have been displayed accordingly. There are a few other points with respect to trending. Talk about that in our. Please do like, share and subscribe to our channel.